Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Cem Toker. He's the former chairman of the opposition Liberal Democratic Party, and Matthew Breiser. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan. Also with me in studio is Onur Erim. He's an international policy analyst and a former AK Party advisor. And in Washington, D.C., we have Lawrence Korb, or Larry Korb. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense and now a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Gentlemen, good to have you on the program. Good to have this debate. I'm going to ask you all the same question to begin with. Let me start with Onur Erim. Is Turkey sliding towards dictatorship?
If by that you're asking if Turkey is sliding towards dictatorship via Erdogan's rule, party rule, or as a president in power, I don't think so. I don't think you could make this claim for a politician that has gone to elections, I guess, 9 or 8 times already in the last 16 years. For a person that is constantly getting its right to rule with an overwhelming majority under the new system, and hopefully with this Sunday as well, I don't know if you could make the claim that it's moving towards dictatorship.
Okay, so it doesn't check out for you. Matthew Breiser?
Yeah, dictatorship is a strong word, and clearly by, I'm sure President Erdogan's own account, he would recognize that there's been backsliding on democratic freedoms. I mean, there's a state of emergency, which he talks openly about. But I do not feel Turkey's sliding toward a dictatorship. As you said, elections matter. They really matter here. And whereas in the past the ruling AKP could gain a controlling stake of the Turkish parliament with a victory of 35% of the vote, they now need 50% of the votes plus 1. So democracy is still alive. It may be a peculiar form here. And what really matters in terms of whether Turkey would ever slide toward democracy is what happens after this election.
Cem Toker, democracy is alive and well. Turkey's not sliding towards dictatorship, according to the other two guests. What do you think?
I disagree.
Tell me why.
Well, by definition, if you look into Cambridge, any dictionary in the world, will tell you, will define dictator or dictatorship as someone holding all political power to himself and by himself. And that is the case in Turkey, without any separation of powers and without any checks and balances. And the fact that a country holds elections frequently doesn't make it a democracy. Putin holds elections.
Sure.
Mubarak held elections every 4 years, but he was in power for 30 years. Presidential elections, parliamentary elections in Azerbaijan. Aliyev holds elections.
Okay, so realistically, let me ask you, is it possible after this election that the AKP could lose control of parliament, A? And is it possible that President Erdogan, especially if it goes to a second round, could lose the presidency?
I don't see how. No.
It's not possible?
It is not possible.
So why are they all campaigning?
Well,
why is the CHP so energized?
well,
why
because
is
it's a circus.
the party?
Because
It's a
it's a
circus. So you don't
circus.
believe in this system?
Current system, I cannot call it a democracy.
Is it
I cannot
rigged or
call it
is it not?
fair, open, just, democratic elections. You can hold
So you don't see it as fair?
elections
Okay.
every Sunday if you want. That does
Right.
not make you a democracy.
Okay, interesting point. Larry Korb, is Turkey sliding towards dictatorship?
Well, I think that they're moving in that direction. The real question becomes what happens if Erdogan's party loses control of the parliament this year. Will he allow himself to have checks and balances, or will he continue to arrest people who disagree with him, or will there be any fixing of the ballots? In other words, if he loses votes from the Kurds, which he used to do very well with, but now given what's happened in Syria, will he lose support for those? Will he try and make it out that he got more? So I think that's the real question. They're at an inflection point, and we'll see what happens, particularly after this election, and how many votes he gets the first time. I don't think he's going to get a majority the first time.
So you said you don't think he's going to get a majority. Well, he can't be a really good dictator then, can he? If he's not going to get the votes? That's democracy, isn't it? He's doing a bad job of being a dictator if he might not get the votes.
Well, I agree, but the real question is, what does he do then? okay, if he doesn't get the votes and you have a runoff and he wins, and what happens after that? Will he try and lock up more of his political opponents as he has in the past?
Okay.
And will he allow himself to have the parliament to have checks and balances
Okay,
on
but
him?
have you got any evidence that he has locked up political opponents that have defeated him in an election straight after an election?
Well, I have evidence that he's locked up an awful lot of people, okay, over the years, without trials. And so the question is, could have been potential political opponents.
Okay. Onur Ariel, let's look at it from another perspective. What if dictatorship's not the way to look at it, but others look at rolling back of democratic rights? So, for example, Amnesty International, in their annual report 2017-18, says the ongoing state of emergency set a backdrop for violations of human rights. Dissent ruthlessly suppressed, with journalists, political activists, and human rights defenders among those targeted. Instances of torture continued to be reported, and they speak about, since the failed coup attempt of July 2016, they don't like what's been going on in Turkey. Would you concede then that, yes, democracy is still alive and healthy, but there are big question marks over the health of the democracy? Is that fair?
Well, I mean, for those of us living in Turkey, especially for those like myself, a Turk living in Turkey, it is sometimes hard for us to comprehend the level of democracy that people enjoy in countries like United States. You know, we unfortunately, in some cases during some history, and maybe still to some degree, lock up people maybe for no reason, without a trial. You know, we don't have places like Guantanamo Bay in Turkey, unfortunately, that we could do this outside of Turkey. We do it inside Turkey. But let's put this aside for a second. The biggest problem is, and yes, I do agree that there are some problems in Turkish democracy and Turkish justice system, as there have been for the years. But we have to explain and look into everything as before July 15th and after July 15th. Now, those things, issues, problems that delivered us to the point of July 15th was also due to some of the inner problems in Turkey. Turkey allowing a lot of fetoists into the system,
Right.
and things as such. But we have to look at everything and assess everything before and after July 15th. Has things gone a little bit worse since July 15th? Yes, but it had to get a little bit worse to get better.
Okay, Cem Toker, let me ask you this question then. It's a hypothetical, but it's sincere. I'm not trying to trick you here. If in a first round, President Erdogan doesn't get more than 50%, we go to a second round,
Right.
and he loses.
Right.
Say, for example, to Muharrem Ince. You're still going to think the system was rigged?
I'll eat my words then. Simple as that. But that's a hypothetical question. I usually don't answer hypothetical questions. But if that happens, then I'll backtrack and
Is there no
reevaluate
Okay.
the situation.
But is there no amount of value that you can attribute to the millions of Turks who will go to the polls
Yes.
this weekend and possibly even beyond, who sincerely want to vote for whoever they want to vote for, whether
They
it's
cannot-
President Erdogan
no,
or anybody
no.
else?
Let me tell you this. An election is the last indicator of a democracy. In a democracy, you have rules and institutions independent from political parties, such as this institution, TRT, or Rütük, that's overlooking the entire television system.
And we're
or
responsible to the taxpayers,
Constitutional
right?
Court.
And we're
you know-
accountable to the taxpayers.
Right.
We're having this debate.
Right,
We're
right,
discussing
right,
it.
right.
Isn't that a good
You-
thing?
Yeah, it's an exception. You know your record, it's in the press, how much coverage time you have provided to certain parties. I am an opponent, I was an opponent party leader for 12 years. You know how many times I was in the studio, despite the fact that my party participated in 2007 elections, 2011 elections, 2 referendums, 2009 local elections, 2014 local elections, 2015 twice. You know how many times I was in the studio? One time.
Okay, so Matthew
So-
Breiser, has there been an uneven playing field when it comes to the different parties?
Well, yeah, under a state of emergency, right? The rules, the normal rules are suspended. Yeah, we have the Mr. Demirtas, who is imprisoned right now. And clearly, we just heard from Canbay that it's been difficult for opposition parties to get their voices heard. Now, there is this 10 minutes that, that each political party leader is allocated, but
Provided by General Evren.
He
made that law.
By General Evren, really?
He passed that law, yeah, the coup leader.
Yeah. So, but my last point I wanted to make is, if you look at what happened in the referendum, yes, the political system here changed to be a presidentially dominated system, and the actual powers of President Erdogan are not all that different from those of the U.S. president, right? It's a strong presidency. What hasn't happened here, you have not seen opposition leaders flourish, and leaders, especially of the major opposition party, who really wanted it, who really wanted to lead. It's a big criticism of the CHP leader, Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu. Now there is a candidate, Mr. Ince, who seems ready to try to lead. So when I said what matters is what happens after this election, I mean that he will have a chance to try to build a vibrant opposition party headed by somebody who really wants to compete. That will be a new era in Turkish politics.
But you think President Erdogan's going to win?
I do.
Yeah. So, Onur, I passed through Beşiktaş on the weekend, just got off the ferry coming from the Asian side. It was very vibrant, a lot of opposition supporters. You had HDP supporters, CHP supporters, E-Party supporters, campaigning, young people, and so forth. Cem believes all of that's a circus, and those people are being involved in a system that is rigged against them. What's your response to him?
We may discuss, agree or disagree on many parts of this government to be democratic or otherwise. But I think if you look at the history of Turkish elections and the reaction of the people, you will see that the elections in Turkey are probably the most fairest and most democratic of all institutions in Turkey. Let's just believe for a second that bin Laden hasn't been killed and was in a prison serving a life sentence in the US. If you can name me one major presidential nominee that would come out in the States, say that we will bring out bin Laden and put his statues all over, that all of...
So who are you referring to here?
Demirtas, of course.
Yeah, but in terms of who was he talking about?
Demirtas is not in prison because there is a state of emergency in Turkey. Demirtas wasn't put into prison 2 weeks ago. He was put in prison 20 months ago. Now, we could sit here and discuss that these and to me, it's unbelievable either, that to have somebody without a court case for 20 months is unbelievable. Right. It's unjust. Yes, that is correct. But Demirtas is there for having put clear support for PKK and having shown clear and absolute support for Abdullah Öcalan, who's a convicted terrorist leader, serving more than one life sentence.
Is that the comparison you were making, Öcalan?
That's exactly what. So
okay.
If you can show me one nominee in the future, a major presidential nominee in the U.S., then I would say yes, the democracy level that we are enjoying here is not that great. But as I said, I'm not talking about the entire government, but the most fairest and most democratic institution of democracy that we've been enjoying for over the years, except for with the exception of 1983, when the referendum was held for the new president after the coup.
Okay.
We have enjoyed many good times with the elections.
So Cem, there are those who say Demirtas shouldn't be in jail, and there are those who say he's in jail for support of the PKK, and despite all of that, the man still got his 10 minutes because he's running for president.
Well, he should have, because he wasn't convicted.
Okay.
If there was rule of law in Turkey, he would have been either released or been convicted. His trial should have been over by now.
Should some credit be due then, that the man's up there, his posters are up there, and he's still running for president, even though he's in jail?
He's not convicted. And man is innocent until proven guilty. Have anybody heard this in Turkey? Have you?
Do you believe that's under question?
That is a basic principle of law since Romans. But it hasn't stopped by in Turkey, that concept. A man is innocent until proven guilty.
If he's convicted, would you
If he's
support
convicted, then he can appeal it, take it wherever he wants.
So the justice
due process,
you trust the justice system.
Due process of law.
But you trust the justice system then?
Don't put words in my mouth.
I'm saying, you said if he's convicted, you'd accept that, right?
I would, but I should also point out, in the rule of law index worldwide, put out by the Economic Forum, and the impartiality and independence of the judiciary, Turkey ranks dismally with African dictatorships.
Right.
So,
Okay.
that's it.
Okay.
I
So,
rest my case.
okay, Larry Korb, do you want the opposition to win?
Well, I think what we want in the United States is a fair and open election that puts people in there who are subject to checks and balances. Obviously, and I think that from the discussion, it's clear Turkey is moving away from that. The real question now, this is an inflection point. What will happen from here on in? Will Erdogan, in a sense, be president for life? Will he continue to do things that weaken his opposition? And as just been pointed out, when you look at the index of democracy, now no democracy is perfect, but Turkey is going the wrong way from what it used to be. I remember when I was in government, we used to tell the people in the Muslim world, you've got two models here. You've got the Turkish model, you've got the Iranian model. Which way do you want to go? I don't know if I could do that anymore in terms of what's happened under Erdogan.
Okay, Onur, is that fair? Does Turkey have an image problem now? It's not even seen as a model now for the United States to show others the way?
I don't think anybody could argue otherwise, that especially in the West and the U.S., that Turkey has been being attacked with an image problem. Now, is there some right to this, that they're attacking? Yes. Is it as much as that we are suffering from this? I don't think so. Now, we have to realize most of the image makers of Turkey for the past 12 years were held by FETÖ members. When you take them out of the equation, and when actually they're working against you, I think it played a lot of role with Turkey's bad image problem since 2012, 2013. And Turkey, unfortunately, the government has not been successful enough to send out new people to clear this image, talk about the right things. The last time I was in DC was about 4 months ago, where, again, we're suffering probably the most problems when it comes to image. And I actually heard this more than a few times, that, hey, we talked about issues, they asked questions, and they said, you know what, you're the first guy we have been seeing for the last couple of months talking something about pro-Turkey. So, yes, Turkey has been suffering a lot of image problem. Again, this has a lot to do with when, especially in the U.S., FETÖ members were holding. Unfortunately, they were given this job, whether officially or not. They were given this job to do Turkey's image making in D.C. And when you take them out of the equation, and when they are working against you with all their connections, with all their grassroots
They helped with
events,
soft power in the past, but now they're...
And unfortunately, the government has not been doing maybe even anything to do this for the last 2 or 3 years.
Cem Toker, do you have a problem with the powers of the presidential system?
Powers?
Yeah,
unchecked powers, unlimited powers. Without any checks and balances, it's not a presidential system.
Would you trust, for example, Meral Aksener with those powers?
She doesn't want those powers. She publicly said that. She wants to go back to the parliamentarian. I am all for the presidential system. I represent the only party in Turkish politics since 1994, quarter of a century, asked for the presidential system because it brings a more stable system. But what they brought on April 16th last year is anything but presidential system. So, what's his name? Ince. He wants to go back to parliament. Rather than do that, he should, if he can separate the powers, as he says, he doesn't want any judges standing up before him. He's going to pull out the Minister of Justice from the Judges Council, Prosecutors. If he can do those, he can separate the powers. He can get his powers checked and balanced by the other two, legislative and judiciary. Then we're talking about a good presidential system. Then I don't have any problems with that. But Erdogan wouldn't do that.
Okay. Well, let's see. The vote's coming up. These are fascinating times in Turkey, and I'm really glad and privileged to have this conversation with all of you. Cem, Matthew, Onur, and Larry, I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers.